dress and a costume. So, and the lady that I'm doing the personality on, I truly believe was a virtuous woman, though she's been gone probably 150 years, but she's somebody that I've heard stories about since I was a little girl, and I admired her. There's several ladies that I've heard stories about. First of all, I'd like to read in Proverbs the definition of a virtuous woman, and that is pretty much my profile is a profile of a virtuous woman this morning. So in the book of Proverbs, beginning with the 10th verse, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant's ship, she bringeth her food from afar. She riseth up while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it with the fruit of her hands, and planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good, her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She strengtheneth out her hand, stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry, her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen and selleth it, and delivereth girdles to the merchants. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Give of her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. And I believe this woman fits that criteria, that definition. Her name was Mary Elizabeth, and she was born October 10th, 1830, in Rowan County, Tennessee. Most people who knew her called her Polly, and I don't know why. Polly was like a nickname for Mary at that time. So her husband called her Polly, and most of the other people who knew her called her Aunt Pop. And she was the daughter of John Mann and Delilah Woody Mann. And when she was 18, they, with 11 other families, built a raft and put all of their goods on that raft, and I think she was one of like 13 brothers and sisters. So you've got 12 families and all of their worldly goods on this raft floating down the Mississippi River to the Red River at a point in Louisiana, where they took a riverboat up the Red River to Shreveport, and they went by ox and wagon to Upshur County in Texas, which is just above Dallas, Texas. And there they lived for about 10 years before moving on to Wise County. But while they were in Upshur, she met and fell in love with Thomas Newton McCright, who, through the years, the name has changed from McCright to McWright. So you can tell that Southerners kind of changed things. And they had their first son about a year after they were married, John. And about a year after that, they had their second son, who sadly would not live but a month, being born September 18th, and he passed away October 18th. But after that, they would have 5 more sons. And after those 10 years, they moved on up a little bit higher where family members had gone and set up homesteads in Wise County. And they lived under a grouping of oak trees while their one-room cabin, log cabin, was being built with the help of 2 of her brothers and neighbors. And the cabin had a north-facing door, no windows in the cabin, and an 8-foot fireplace on the east wall. And everything they did was done in this one room. They slept, they ate, they cooked, they made their clothes, they worked on whatever they had to work on at night. They read the Bible by firelight, by the fireplace at night. And they also taught until the school was built, they taught their kids to read and write and taught them Sunday school. And when they had first moved to Upshur County, they belonged to a Baptist church. And when they had moved to Wise County, the whole family couldn't go because it was 7 miles away. So he would get up every Sunday morning and walk 7 miles to church. And when their church was established close by, the whole family could go. Well, this is in around 1860, 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War. And the Texas Secession Committee came into office and voted to secede Texas from the Union into the Confederacy. And I know you've heard of Sam Houston, the governor of Texas. He did not agree with this. And he refused to swear loyalty to the Confederacy, so they removed him from office. And this was the leader of the Texas Revolution who fought Santa Anna. And he wrote to people there. But he was removed from office, and he moved to the area named after him, Houston. And that's where he lived out the rest of his days. And there were quite a few people who did not really agree with this, and they formed an organization called the Peace Party. And Thomas, Mary's husband, belonged to this, and several of his neighbors and several friends. And there was an uprising in Decatur, a little bit south of there, where several men were hung because they did not agree with the Confederacy and they would not join the Confederate Army. And so Mary's brother and another family friend talked to Thomas and told him probably his best bet of being able to survive and to get back to his family would be go ahead and enlist in the Confederate Army. So he enlisted. And he enlisted before there were like this Confederate convention okayed for bounty hunters to go out and would get a certain amount of money for everybody that they could get to enlist in the Army. So he went ahead and signed up before they could get to him. And he walked, I think it took them 40 days, or somewhere around 40 days, to walk 570 miles from where they lived to Arkansas Post, or Fort Hindman in Arkansas. And that's where he was stationed. He stayed there for a little over 2 years, something like, or about a year or something like that. He wrote several letters home that are now in the archive of the University of Texas in Arlington. And I have copies of them. But he wrote letters home telling his family, never really complaining that much about his situation or anything, but he would beg her in her letters to be sure and train the children in the way they should go. He spoke of his love for God. He spoke of the deprivations and the hardships that they had. But he said, all in all, he was not afraid to die, but he wanted to make sure that his family all would be in heaven one day. And he made sure that he asked her to make sure that you teach the children to go in the right way. In 1862, they were overrun by Union forces who captured everyone there in Arkansas Post and took them to Camp Douglas in Chicago, Illinois, where he died a couple of months later from dysentery and pneumonia before he could go on trial. And that was a very sad letter. They have his last letter home that bids farewell to his family and talks of his love for God and the importance of coming to know the Savior, and how he really asked her to be sure to be the mother that she needed to be and make sure that their children knew who Jesus was, knew who God was. And he was, I think she was like 32 at this time. She found herself with 8 children under the age of 10, a widow. And of course, in those times, you know, it wasn't that long after they had moved into their cabin. They had no savings account in the bank. They had no insurance. That kind of thing didn't exist at that time. So here she was on her property with these children, and of course she had some family members close by, but they weren't like next door neighbors like we have today, you know. And so she did the best she could. She made sure that she got seed from somewhere, and she did start a garden, but at first they had like wild turkey and wild hogs until they could get tame hogs and pigs in and other livestock and that sort of thing. They had cows and sheep, but because where the cabin was situated, it was right on, not very far from the prairie that had been Comanche territory. And the Comanche were still running and still bothering the settlers out that way. So she had a hole built in the floor, dug under the floor, right in front of the hearth where she would put the kids if there was any unrest or any threat. And she would stand guard at the door with her gun. And I don't know how many times that happened. It's not printed in history that I can find. And, but she was faithful to make sure her children went to school, to make sure that her children went to church. And the church, I think, was probably on a piece of land donated by her and her brothers. And they had a camp meeting one night, or one week, and there was families from pretty far out that showed up, and they got word that the Comanche were on the warpath, and they were headed in that direction. So the people that were there, it was too far for them to go at night in their horse and wagon, so they just went to the nearest neighbors. And she had about 23 people in her one-room cabin that night, where they put all the kids in the hole under the floor, and the men set up and kept watch all night. Well, the Indians had gone north of them and really didn't come as close as they thought they were going to come, which was a big relief to them. Well, over the years, you know, she had to watch her. It was free range law at the time. They didn't have fences anywhere. So you had to be sure to brand your cattle if you wanted to keep them. If calves were born, you had to get out there and brand them before cattle thieves could get a hold of them, or renegade Indians. And so her oldest boys had to be shepherds. They had to stand out there and keep a close watch on everything they had. She lost quite a bit of cattle at that time. She lost several calves that she was not able to keep up with. But I'm sure over the years she learned, and those boys learned how to get out there and make things safe. And she became a pretty well-known person in her community. She donated land. Her and her brothers donated land to the school to have a school built on it. They donated the land that had a cemetery that's built on it, where she's buried today. And I think her parents were the first people that were buried there. And she had, you know, when they first moved into that cabin, she had 6 boys. She had a daughter after they moved in, was their only daughter. And then she had another son that was born 2 months, I think, after Thomas left for the war. And she raised them in the nurture and admonition. I'll get it out. Anyway, she raised them to love God. As far as we know, all of her children had been saved, were saved and baptized, and I just feel that they're all in heaven together. And I think she did the best she could. I really do. I don't think that she made up excuses why she couldn't do some things. She knew what had to be done, and she did it. But she did it with the help of God. He was her strength. He was who she relied on because her husband wasn't there. And I think about 10 years or so after her youngest son was born, no, it had to be more than that, probably about 15 years after her son was born, she took in an orphan on top of that, a little 5-year-old girl that she raised as her own, and would live with her until Mary herself passed away. Well, she told stories of her faith, and she told stories of Thomas, and of course everybody knew who Thomas was because she kept his memory alive. They knew who God and Jesus was because she kept that alive before her children. And her faith, I think, was passed on down to her children and her grandchildren. And little did she know that one day her granddaughter would rely on that faith. She would tell stories to her own grandchildren of riding a train to visit her grandmother, who had stood watch during the night with a gun in case the Indians came. And how one day this granddaughter, who would teach herself to play the piano, I'd never heard a story like this before, but she had a long strip of paper with piano keys drawn on it and shape notes diagrammed on each of the keys so she would know where the notes were. And that's how she learned to play the piano. One Sunday morning, she went to church. They didn't have a piano player. And her husband, Clarence, said, "Mama can play." And she said, with shaking in her shoes, she got up and went to the piano. And with the help of the Lord, she played the piano that morning. Wow. And then again for the next 30 years. She was the church piano player. And she would tell those stories to her children and her great-grandchildren and her grandchildren. And I'm sure she wouldn't know that one day her granddaughter would stand in front of all of you and tell their stories and keep their stories alive. And just know how these women really left a legacy for other women in our family to follow. How their strength and their fortitude just kept that story alive, and how I really don't know of anybody on that side of the family who has not been in church, who has not, in some ways, I know everybody hasn't gotten saved, you know, that's a good dream, but most people will talk of the Lord, and they'll look fondly back at Mary McCright. And it's just, it makes me proud to be her great-great-granddaughter.
Yes.
And I would really don't want to ever do anything that will stop that succession. I know I don't have children, but I know a lot of children that I can pass those stories on to. And it doesn't cost you a whole lot to live for the Lord if you look at the rewards down the road.
That's right.
And I just encourage everyone to live your life like Mary did, so that 150 years later, people will still be telling your story. So I hope you enjoyed it.